"The child is not breathing." Those 4 words crossed the ballroom like a stone dropped into still water, and every ripple of music, laughter, and crystal stopped at once. The Marquis of Halford's winter assembly had been arranged, as all such assemblies were, to demonstrate that money and title could be made to look effortless. 300 candles burned in the chandeliers above the Marchioness's imported Italian plasterwork. The footman wore new livery, ivory with gold braid, and had been instructed not to smile. The flowers were hothouse gardenias brought at considerable expense from a glasshouse in Kent, and their scent lay over the room like something determined to be noticed. Every woman present had dressed with the particular precision of someone who understood that being seen in the right ballroom was itself a form of occupation, and every man had arranged himself within that spectacle with the studied ease of people who have never had to arrange anything. And at the edge of all that gilded performance, halfway down the servants' corridor that ran behind the east wall of the ballroom, holding a candle in one hand and a household ledger in the other, was Miss Cecily Marsh. She had not been invited to the assembly. She had not expected to be. Her position in the Halford household occupied the uncomfortable space between guest and servant. She was the late Lady Halford's niece, which gave her a room on the family floor and a seat at the informal dinner table, and it gave her precisely nothing else. No allowance, no introduction, no recognition that she had been managing the Halford household accounts for 3 years and 4 months without a single quarter's payment. She heard the words through the wall. She did not wait for clarification. The child in question was Lord Ashford's son. She knew this because she had seen the boy earlier in the evening, a small, serious figure of perhaps 4 years old, who had been brought downstairs by his nurse to be shown to his father's dinner guests, and had looked at the assembled company with the particular expression of a child who has decided adults are largely inexplicable. His father, Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, had acknowledged the boy with a nod and returned to his conversation. The boy had looked at that nod for a long moment, then turned and allowed his nurse to take him back upstairs. Cecily set the ledger on the corridor shelf and moved. She climbed the back stairs at a pace that was not quite running. She had learned, in 3 years of managing a house that was not her own, that running alarmed the staff and accomplished nothing a brisk walk could not, and found the boy's room on the nursery floor by following the sound of the nurse's voice, which had passed beyond instruction into something fraying at the edges. The boy was on the floor beside his small bed. He was 4 years old, and his lips had gone the color of river slate. The nurse was on her knees beside him, calling his name, James. The boy was called James, and doing nothing else because she did not know what else to do. Cecily set down her candle, knelt, and turned the child onto his side. She had learned what she knew about infant crises from a book on household medicine that had belonged to her mother, which she had read at the age of 14 during the winter. Her father's estate manager quit without notice, and she had found herself responsible for a household of 8 with no functioning staff hierarchy and no instruction from anyone. She had read it because it was there, and because she had the kind of mind that treated available information as a practical resource rather than an intellectual exercise. She had not expected to need it in a Mayfair ballroom. She pressed 2 fingers firmly beneath the child's small ribs once, then again. She kept her voice steady and told the nurse to bring warm water and the camphor oil from the medicine chest in the housekeeper's room. The nurse, grateful to be given something specific to do, went. The child coughed. It was a broken, effortful sound, and then a second one, and then he breathed. Cecily sat back on her heels. She pressed one hand briefly against the wall behind her and felt the plaster cool and solid against her palm. Then she picked the boy up because he had begun to cry, the good, indignant crying of a child who has been frightened and is now announcing it to the available world, and she held him against her shoulder and walked the length of the room twice until the crying settled into sniffling, and then into the particular heaviness of a child falling towards sleep. She was still holding him when the door opened. Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, filled the doorframe in a dark tailcoat that had not been made for standing in nursery doorways. He had been told his son had been found unwell, which was the version of events that the footman had chosen to communicate, and he had come upstairs with the particular controlled speed of a man who does not permit himself to appear alarmed in company. He stopped when he saw the child in her arms. He stood very still. The boy was breathing visibly and audibly against Cecily's shoulder. His small hand had closed around the edge of her sleeve. Cecily met the Duke's eyes across the candlelit room and said nothing, because there was nothing that required saying. She had learned to be accurate rather than comprehensive in the information she provided to people who had not thought to ask her anything in the first place. The Duke looked at her with the measuring attention of someone who has just encountered something they did not account for and does not yet know what to do with the discrepancy. He said after a moment, "You are Lady Halford's niece." It was not a question, and it was not a greeting, and it was not, she noted, any form of gratitude. It was the sentence of a man filing an observation. "Miss Cecily Marsh," she said, "your son swallowed something. I believe it was a button from the coverlet. He has passed it or moved it sufficiently to breathe. You will want the physician to examine him in the morning." She crossed the room and put the child into his small bed, because he was asleep by now and heavier than he looked. She straightened the coverlet. She picked up her candle from the floor. The Duke had not moved from the doorframe. She had to pass him to leave the room, and when she did, she felt his gaze follow her into the corridor with the quality of a man recalculating something he had previously settled. She went back to the shelf where she had left the ledger. She picked it up. She continued working. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. Cecily Marsh had come to the Halford household in the autumn of 1812, at the age of 22, following the death of her father and the subsequent discovery that he had died owing considerably more than the estate was worth. The discovery had taken 3 months to fully articulate itself because the estate's accounts had been kept in a state of organized incomprehensibility that she had spent those 3 months translating from her father's private system into something a solicitor could read. She had done it without help, working at the writing table in her father's study by the light of 2 candles, because the oil budget she had herself maintained had been reduced that winter, and she saw no reason to revise it on her own behalf. The solicitor, a patient man named Mr. Edward Langley, who had handled the Marsh estate for 20 years, had watched her spread the translated accounts across his desk one morning in November, and had not said anything for a long time. "You did this," he had said finally. "It was not entirely a question. My father's system was legible once you understood the principles behind it," she said. "The difficulty was that no one else had thought to understand them." Langley had looked at her with an expression she had not known how to read at 22 and understood better now. It was the expression of a man who has encountered quality in a place that has given him no language for it. He had said he was sorry about the estate. He had meant it. The estate was sold to cover the debts. The remainder, after legal fees and creditor settlements, amounted to £112, which Cecily received in March of 1813 and placed immediately into a savings account she had identified through Langley's recommendation, because she had understood from the moment the solicitor spread the estate papers across his desk that she was going to need every tool she possessed, and probably several she hadn't yet located. Her mother's sister, Lady Halford, a woman of organized social aspiration and limited organizational capacity, had written to offer Cecily a home. The letter had used the word home in a way that Cecily, reading it carefully, understood to mean a room and meals, and if she were observant, something useful to do. She had accepted. She had packed everything she owned into 2 trunks and arrived at the Halford townhouse on a Tuesday morning and been shown to her room by a housemaid who looked uncertain whether she should knock first. By Thursday, she had identified 3 inefficiencies in the household supplier arrangements. By the following Monday, she had spoken to the housekeeper about them carefully, as a question rather than a correction. By the end of the month, the housekeeper had given her the household ledger with the expression of a woman who has been carrying a burden slightly too long and has just found somewhere it might be set down. Lady Halford had not commented on any of this. She had simply begun, over the course of that first quarter, to relay instructions through Cecily rather than directly to the staff, and to present her niece to visitors as our Cecily, with the particular affection of someone who has discovered a useful mechanism and wishes to keep it functioning smoothly. The mechanism was not paid. The mechanism was not acknowledged in any formal way. The mechanism wore last season's muslin and sat at the end of the dinner table and was pleasant to the guests and knew, at any given moment, the current status of every outstanding household account, every servant's particular difficulty, and every supplier's terms. There was a moment, in the second winter of this arrangement, when Cecily had sat at the writing table with the quarterly accounts spread before her and felt something cold settle over her like weather coming in. The Halford estate had 3 creditor arrangements that required management, a wool supplier contract that had never been renegotiated despite a 7-year relationship and shifting market prices, and a roof repair on the Lincolnshire property that the Marquis had been deferring for 18 months. She had drafted proposals for all 3 in the space of 2 evenings. She had placed them on the Marquis's desk with a note that was precise and brief and free of any language that might suggest she expected credit. The Marquess had implemented all 3 proposals without comment. The wool supplier renegotiation alone had recovered £40 a quarter in previously lost margin. She had sat with that knowledge for a long time. She had not broken. She had, instead, made a decision that she returned to periodically when the weight of invisible work pressed itself against her in the small hours. She was not going to become less than she was because the people around her found it convenient to look elsewhere. She had a mind that could read patterns in a disordered ledger and translate them into something workable. That capacity existed whether or not anyone in the Halford household attached her name to it. She intended to survive, and she intended to do it with everything she had. Her one consolation, if it could be called that without overstating it, was Mr. Langley, who had remained her solicitor through the estate settlement and had maintained a quiet professional correspondence with her since. He was 63 years old, had handled estates of considerable complexity for 4 decades, and had the particular quality of a man who listens first and concludes second. When Cecily's letters described, in careful professional language, the arrangements she had made for the Halford household, Langley read between the precise sentences with the ease of long practice. He had written back, in the spring of 1814, that she had a quality of mind that would be wasted on household ledgers for the rest of her life, and that he wished the world were arranged more sensibly. She had read the letter twice. She had placed it in the box beneath her bed where she kept there things that were true and useful to remember. Then she had returned to the quarterly accounts. There was also, in the Halford household, a woman named Mrs. Helena Price, the wife of the Marquess's land agent who came to London for the season and occupied the room 2 doors down from Cecily's, who had arrived in March of 1814 and taken the full measure of Cecily Marsh in approximately 4 minutes of conversation before announcing that she thought the arrangement the Halford household had come to was thoroughly unreasonable. that Cecily was clearly the most practically capable person in the building, and that Helena intended to be her friend whether Cecily agreed to the arrangement or not. Cecily had found this direct and had, after a moment's consideration, agreed to the arrangement. Helena was the kind of woman who saw clearly and said precisely what she saw, which was a quality Cecily recognized and valued in the particular way you value something you have not been offered often enough. She did not rescue Cecily from anything. She witnessed her, which was a different thing, and in Cecily's experience, considerably rarer. These were the materials she had assembled by the winter of 1815. 3 years and 4 months of invisible estate management, one box of true things, one friend who witnessed her clearly, and one solicitor who thought the world was arranged wrongly. She had built a great deal out of considerably less. Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, had dismissed Miss Marsh the morning after his son's crisis in the way that powerful men dismiss things that do not fit into their existing arrangements, not with cruelty, but with the particular efficiency of someone who has already moved on to the next item on their list. He had sent a formal note of thanks to Lady Halford, not to Miss Marsh, which had arrived at the Halford house on a Thursday, and been read aloud at breakfast with considerable self-congratulation by the Marchioness, who had managed to reframe the entire event into a story about the quality of guests her household produced. Cecily had listened, said nothing, and returned to the quarterly accounts for the Lincolnshire property. The roof there would need addressing before March. She had the figures. Ashford did not forget her, which was something he did not admit to himself for several weeks. He was a man who had learned, during 4 years of particular grief, to distrust anything that arrived unexpected and refused to resolve itself into a legible category. His wife had died in the winter of 1811. Fever, rapid, without any of the dignified preparation that the social machinery around death preferred, and he had responded to that loss by doing what he had been trained to do since childhood. He had closed everything down to its functional minimum, and he had continued. He attended the necessary events. He managed his estates. He produced his heir, who was 4 years old and serious and had his mother's coloring, and he did not discuss any of this with anyone because the relevant people were either dead or incapable of useful response. He had been at the Halford Assembly because it was the correct event to attend in the 3rd week of December, and because Ashford's position required him to attend the correct events regardless of his private feelings about gilded chandeliers and performative gardenias. He had not thought about Miss Marsh again after sending the note. He had told himself this clearly on several occasions, which was itself information, had he been in a state to read it. In January of 1816 he received a request, routed through his estate solicitor, a man named Harrison, who was thorough and occasionally surprised, from a woman identifying herself as Miss Cecily Marsh, requesting to review the terms of the Ashford Estates wool supplier contract on behalf of Lord Halford, whose own supplier arrangements were tied to the same regional market. Harrison brought the request to Ashford with the expression of a man who is not certain whether this is unusual. Ashford read the letter twice. It was extremely precise. It contained 3 specific references to current wool market terms, 1 citation of the specific contract clause that governed renegotiation timing, and a proposed meeting date. It was signed with a clarity that matched everything else about it. He remembered the nursery. He remembered the child breathing against her shoulder. He remembered the particular quality of her stillness when she had put the boy down and picked up the candle, as though she had simply completed something that needed completing and was moving on to the next item without requiring anyone to notice. He told Harrison to confirm the meeting. He arrived early, which he did not do by accident. He wanted to see how she occupied her room before she was aware of being observed. She occupied it the way she occupied everything. efficiently, and without ornamentation. She was already seated at the solicitor's table with a folder of documents in front of her that she had apparently been reviewing. She was wearing a dark blue dress that was not new and was exceptionally clean, and her hair was arranged in the particular way of someone who has no lady's maid and is very good at the task regardless. She looked up when he entered and said, "Your Grace," in the tone of someone who has prepared for a meeting and is ready to begin it. He sat. He watched her arrange the documents. Harrison had pulled Ashford aside before the meeting and mentioned, in the careful manner of a man who has discovered something and is uncertain how to place it, that Miss Marsh had also sent a preliminary analysis of the Ashford estate's current wool contract, including the 3 most recent quarterly payment figures and a comparison with current regional pricing. It was, Harrison had said, the kind of analysis that usually took him 3 days to produce. She had apparently done it in the margins of her request letter. "I understand the contract's renegotiation window opens next quarter," Cecily said without preamble, when Harrison had settled himself and produced his pen. "There is a clause on page 7 that limits renegotiation to a 12-week period before renewal, which begins in March. If that window is missed, the terms lock for another 3 years at a rate that is currently 12% above market average." Ashford looked at her. "You read my contract. I requested the relevant sections through Lord Halford's existing commercial correspondence. They were technically accessible." She looked at him steadily. "I did not think you would object to having the information." He did not object to having the information. He was thinking about something else, which was the fact that she had done this research not for her own benefit, but on behalf of the Halford household, which was, as he had understood from Harrison's brief description of Miss Marsh's position there, a household that had given her no material recognition for 3 years of work. She was doing skilled work for someone else's advantage. Again, "The Lord Halford arrangement," he said. "You manage his household accounts." A pause. "Not long. I assist with a number of organizational matters. Are you paid?" She met his eyes with the specific expression of a person who has decided to answer honestly rather than carefully. "No." The room was quiet. Harrison appeared to be studying his pen. Ashford made a decision. He made it with the particular internal certainty that it always characterized how he committed to things once he was certain. He did not speak it immediately because it required some arrangement first, and he was not a man who spoke before the arrangement was ready. "We will proceed with the renegotiation on your recommended timeline," he said. "I will also want a review of 3 other supplier contracts. Harrison will send you the documents as a formal consultation, for which there will be a formal fee." She looked at him for a moment. He had the impression she was checking the offer for flaws, the way a good structural engineer checks a bridge before crossing it. "I understand," she said. He left the meeting thinking about her, which he acknowledged to himself on the carriage ride home, with the private candor of a man who has decided to stop pretending that he is not thinking about something. She was not beautiful in the way that the season expected women to be beautiful. She was precise and clear-eyed, and had a quality that he had not encountered often, which was the ability to be completely present in a room without requiring anything from the room in return. His mother had had something of that quality. He had not thought about his mother's particular way of being present in a room for 4 years, and thinking about it now felt like finding a door he had not known was still in the wall. He hired Harrison's junior clerk to compile a formal report on Miss Marsh's background and current position. The report came back in a week and confirmed what he had already begun to understand. She had been managing the Halford household's functional infrastructure for 3 years with no compensation, no acknowledgement, and, as the clerk noted with the careful neutrality of a man recording facts, no prospect of any. There was one additional detail in the report. During the spring of 1814, Miss Marsh had, on her own initiative, renegotiated a wool supplier contract for the Halford estate, recovering an estimated £40 per quarter in previously lost margin. Lord Halford had sent the wool supplier a letter of satisfaction. He had not mentioned Miss Marsh's name. Ashford read this section of the report twice. Then he stood from his desk, walked to the window, and looked out at the January garden where the gravel paths were edged with frost. He sent Harrison to the Halford house the following morning with a formal request that Miss Marsh be made available for a 6-week consulting engagement at the Ashford Berkshire estate, beginning in February, to conduct a comprehensive review of the estate's commercial arrangements. The fee was named explicitly. It was substantial. He went down that evening to the music room, which he had not opened since the autumn of 1811, and stood inside it for a long time. His mother had played in this room. There was still sheet music on the stand above the pianoforte, in her handwriting, and he had not been able to make himself address it in 4 years. He stood there now, not playing, he did not play, but simply being in the room in a way that felt like acknowledging something he had been walking around. He attended the dinner at Halford's house the following Thursday, at an invitation he had previously declined, and was placed, by the Marchioness's arrangement, at the far end of the table from Miss Marsh. He spent the dinner listening to the woman on his left, who was the daughter of an earl, and had been prepared since birth for precisely this kind of table, and watching, without appearing to watch, the woman at the far end who was managing the evening. He could see her managing it, the quiet adjustment of a misdirected footman, the murmured word to the housekeeper who appeared at the door. With her attention distributed between her dinner companion and the invisible work of keeping the room functioning, he left without speaking to her. He had what he needed, which was the confirmation that the quality he had identified in that nursery in December was not a situational performance. It was simply who she was. He came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that. The Ashford Berkshire estate received Miss Cecily Marsh on the 2nd of February, 1816, with the particular indifference of a large establishment, presented with a consultant it does not know what to make of. Cecily arrived in a hired carriage with 2 trunks, a portable writing case, and a systematic list of what she expected to find in the estate's commercial arrangements based on the documents Harrison had forwarded. She was met at the door by the Ashford housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Dorothy Finn, who was 61 years old and had managed the estate household for 32 of them, and had initially communicated, through the precise arrangement of her greeting, that she was reserving judgment on this arrangement. By the end of the first day, Mrs. Finn had revised this position. She could recognize competence in her own domain, and the woman standing in her housekeeper's room, asking sensible questions about the estate's quarterly provisioning schedule, was clearly not going to redecorate anything or issue instructions that demonstrated ignorance. By the 3rd day, Mrs. Finn had taken it upon herself to introduce Cecily the particular geography of the estate, which cellars got the damp, which rooms the Duke used and which he had not opened, where the estate records were stored, and in what degree of order. "The West Records Room, Mrs. Finn said on the morning of the 4th day, with a tone that managed to be both informative and diplomatically agnostic, has not been fully indexed since the previous estate manager departed in 1813. His Grace's current manager, Mr. Pryor, works from the primary ledgers in the study. He has not gone through the West Room." Cecily said she would want to look at the West Room. Mrs. Finn produced the key without visible surprise. The West Room contained 17 years of estate records in 3 different filing systems, the most recent of which had been abandoned partway through 1812. It smelled of cold stone and paper, and the particular staleness of a room that has been closed longer than intended. Cecily set her candle on the center table, put her portable writing case on the adjacent chair, and began. She worked through it for 3 days, with breaks for meals that Mrs. Finn produced with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has decided someone deserves feeding properly. By the end of the 3rd day, she had produced a working index and identified 4 anomalies in the estate's historical commercial accounts, the most significant of which was a discrepancy in the standing wool contract that predated the current manager and appeared to reflect a miscalculation in the original term that had never been corrected and had been costing the estate £35 per quarter in overpayment for 11 consecutive years. £420 paid where it was not owed. She wrote the figure down, checked it twice against 3 separate ledger entries, and then sat with it in the cold west room for a moment in the particular stillness of someone absorbing the size of what they have found. She was still sitting there when the door opened and the Duke came in. He stopped when he saw her. He had not known she was in this room. She could tell by slight adjustment in his expression, which was not surprise exactly, but a rearrangement of a man encountering something that was not on his map of the morning. He was not wearing his tailcoat. He was in his waistcoat, his cravat loose at the collar, and there was something about him in that state, less constructed, less armored, that made the room feel different from all the previous rooms she had been in with him. "Mrs. Finn mentioned the records room," he said. "I did not think you had started on it yet. I started 3 days ago." He looked at the organized stacks on the table, the index she had made, the open ledgers. He looked at her. "Have you found something?" he said. It was not a question. She turned the page toward him where she had written the figure. 11 years of overpayment on the wool contract, due to a miscalculation in the original term that was never identified. The adjustment clause is on page 4 of the original agreement. If the discrepancy can be confirmed by the supplier and the ledger evidence is sufficient to support the claim, the estate may be able to recover a portion and will certainly stop the ongoing loss from next quarter. He looked at the page. He looked at it for a long time. £35 a quarter for 11 years, he said. £420 in total overpayment, she confirmed. I have documented the source entries across 7 ledgers. Harrison can verify the methodology. He pulled out the chair across the table and sat. She had not expected this. She had expected him to take the page and leave, or to call for Harrison. Instead, he sat, and he looked at the open ledger nearest to him, and he said, "Show me." She showed him. She walked him through the 7 ledger entries. The original contract term, the miscalculation, the compounded overpayment, the recovery clause. He followed everything she said without asking her to slow down or repeat herself, which she noted. He asked 2 questions, both precise, and she answered them with equal precision. "You have been in that room for 3 days, he said, when they had finished. The indexing required 2 days before the analysis was possible. He was quiet for a moment. "And at Halford's house. The accounts you have managed there, the renegotiated wool contract, the creditor arrangements, the Lincolnshire roof repair." She was very still. "Harrison spoke to you. Harrison showed me his report." "I see. You have been doing this level of work for 3 years, he said. "Without payment, without credit, and without any formal arrangement." "Yes." She did not dress it in softness. He looked at her across the table of organized ledgers and old records that had not been read in 11 years, and she saw in his expression something that was not pity. She would have found pity intolerable, but something older and heavier than admiration, recognition, the specific kind that cost something in the acknowledging. "Your cravat," she said before she had made a full decision to say it, "has been loose at the left side since you came in. It has been bothering me for 20 minutes. She did not know why she said it, perhaps because it was true, and she had a constitutive difficulty with leaving true and useful things unsaid. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached up and straightened it himself, watching her face while he did it, and she felt her composure do something she could not entirely control, which was to become very precise and very careful in the specific way it became when she was managing something important. She picked up her pen. She returned to the ledger. He stayed in the room for another 40 minutes, reading the index she had made, and she let him, and neither of them spoke, and the quiet between them did not feel like silence. It felt like two people who have found, unexpectedly, that they are content to be in the same room without requiring anything from each other, which is a rarer thing than most people recognize until they have been without it for long enough. In the following weeks, the private accumulation of those rooms, the West Records room, the estate library, the garden path on the one afternoon that was warm enough to walk it, built itself into something that had no formal name in the social vocabulary of 1816, but which they both understood. He came to find her in the library on a Tuesday evening when the household was quiet and brought a document she had flagged for review and stayed to talk about it, and then to talk about the estate's history, and then to say, in the particular way he said things that cost him something, that his mother had loved this library. She had spent 2 hours here every morning. He had not been inside it since the autumn of 1811. Cecily had set down the document she was holding. She played, she said. It was not a question. She had seen the sheet music in the music room. She played everything, he said. She played Handel in the evenings, and she played Italian folk songs when she thought no one was listening, and she played things she invented herself and never wrote down, and I cannot remember the exact sound of any of them, which is—" He stopped. He looked at the bookcase. Cecily said nothing. She had learned that certain silences deserve to be complete before anyone moves. "My son does not know what she sounded like," he said. She pressed one hand briefly against the arm of the chair. It was not a gesture he was supposed to see. He saw it. He left the library a few minutes later, and she sat with the document in her lap and the candle burning low, and felt the weight of what he had just offered her. Not an explanation, not a declaration, but a true thing given plainly, which was the only currency she had ever trusted. She went to the music room the following morning when the house was still quiet. The sheet music was in his mother's hand. She could read music. Her mother had taught her the way her mother had taught her a great many practical things before she died, and she sat at the pianoforte and looked at the composition for a long moment. She played it through once slowly, finding the notes. It was a gentle, considered piece, the kind a person plays when they are thinking about something they love. She played it a second time, more fully, and she heard the door in the corridor open and did not stop. She played it to the end. When she looked up, he was standing in the doorway. He had been there for most of the second playing. She had learned not to apologize for things that did not require apology. She met his eyes and waited. He said after a moment, "She would have liked you." His voice had the quality of something taken from a locked room and placed carefully into the available light. She looked at him. "I think I would have liked her," she said. He did not say anything else. He simply stood there for one more moment, and then he straightened, and the Duke came back over his face the way armor comes back over a man who has briefly let it down, and he said he would speak to Harrison about the wool contract recovery claim, and left. She sat at the pianoforte for a long time after he had gone, her hands resting on the keys in a room that had been closed for 4 years and was now open. Helena Price, who had come to visit Cecily for a week on the pretext of a social call to friends in the area, and the actual pretext of being constitutionally incapable of leaving Cecily alone in a situation this significant without witnesses, sat across from Cecily in the latter's room on the 5th evening and looked at her with the direct attention that had defined their friendship since the beginning. "He stays in the rooms where you are," Helena said. "He has attended 3 estate dinners since you arrived, Mrs. Finn tells me he has not attended 3 estate dinners in a calendar year since 1811. Mrs. Finn tells you a great deal, Cecily said. Mrs. Finn is a sensible woman who recognizes what is happening in her own house. Helena adjusted her shawl. What I want to know is what you think is happening. Cecily considered this in the particular way she considered everything. I think he respects the work, Cecily. A pause. She picked up her pen and set it down again. I think he is a man who has been alone for a long time, she said, and who is beginning to find that less necessary than he believed. Helena looked at her steadily. And you? The question sat there. Cecily looked at the ledger on her desk and the portable writing case, and the candle burning with its particular ordinary light. She had been managing things alone for 3 years and 4 months. She had chosen it, in the specific sense that she had chosen to survive, and surviving had required a certain solitary concentration. She had not known until she was in a room with someone who listened, actually listened, as a man studies a bridge that might need to hold weight. How much she had been carrying the silence as something structural. I think, she said carefully, that I have been seen more clearly in 6 weeks than in the previous 3 years. Helena said nothing, which was its own form of the right response. The storm that was gathering around the Ashford consulting arrangement came to a head in the 3rd week of February at a dinner to which Cecily was not invited and which she learned about afterward through a combination of Mrs. Finn's careful reportage in a letter from Langley, who had been consulted. The dinner was hosted by Viscount Graham, who was Ashford's father's closest ally and whose daughter, a woman named Miss Beatrice Graham, had been, in the understanding of their particular social circle, the obvious and appropriate match for the widowed Duke for the better part of 2 years. Miss Beatrice Graham was 24 years old, beautifully educated, and possessed of the particular assurance of a woman who has been told since childhood that she is the right answer to an important question. She was not unkind in any way that could be named directly. She was simply a woman who understood the social machinery of her world and operated it with precision, and who had not yet encountered a situation where the machinery did not resolve in her direction. The elder Duke of Ashford, the Duke's father, Cornelius Cavendish, who still held considerable influence over the Ashford family's social and financial networks despite his son's independence, had attended the dinner and had communicated to his son, through the particular channel of formal concern that the Cavendish family used for things. It preferred not to say directly that the situation with Miss Marsh was drawing comment. He was not wrong. The institutional circle that constituted the Graham-Cavendish social orbit had been producing comment for 10 days. That the Duke of Ashford had engaged a woman of no family and no position to conduct a private review of his estate. That she had been observed in the estate library past 9 in the evening. That she had been in residence for 6 weeks when the original engagement was for 4. That the Duke had not attended a single Graham dinner or social event since her arrival. The comment was not malicious. It was, from the perspective of the social architecture it came from, practical. The machinery had an expected outcome, and something was not fitting. Miss Graham herself arrived at the Ashford estate on the 22nd of February, accompanied by her mother and presented as a social call. She was everything the social machinery expected. She wore a cream gown that had been made with the specific attention of someone who understood visual argument, and she managed the drawing room with the ease of a woman who has been performing this role since the age of 16. She was gracious to Cecily, gracious in the specific way that makes clear the direction in which the graciousness is being deployed, and said, with a smile that had no visible edge, that she understood Miss Marsh had been engaged to assist with some organizational matters which must be terribly useful for the estate. I have been conducting a commercial review of the estate's supplier arrangements, Cecily said. We have identified a significant overpayment in the wool contract, among other adjustments. The estate should recover considerably from the corrections." "How industrious," said Miss Graham. Her tone placed the word in its correct social category, which was the category of things done by people without better options. Cecily looked at her steadily. She did not straighten her spine because her spine was already straight. She did not shift her expression. £420 in recovered overpayment and projected savings of £35 per quarter going forward. The estate's operational margin improves considerably. She said it the way she said everything important. Plainly, completely, without performance. Miss Graham looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a woman encountering a register she is not prepared for. Then she smiled again and turned to address the Duke, who had come in from the estate office and stood in the drawing-room doorway with the controlled neutrality of a man who has read the room and is deciding how to occupy it. "We have been hoping you would join us in town for the Graham dinner next week," Miss Graham said. "Papa has been asking after you." "I am grateful for the invitation," Ashford said. He looked at Cecily once briefly, with the measuring attention that she had come to know as his specific way of checking that something was in order. Then he crossed to a chair and sat. The visit lasted an hour. When the Grahams had gone, Mrs. Finn appeared in the doorway of the drawing-room with a tray of tea and the composed expression of a woman who has seen a great deal and finds most of it comprehensible. "The elder Duke's secretary wrote this morning," Mrs. Finn said, with the careful neutrality of a woman delivering information rather than interpretation. "He has requested a meeting with you in London." Ashford, who was reading the document Cecily had left on the side table before Miss Graham arrived, looked up. "I know." He looked back at the document. "Miss Marsh, I would like you to prepare a written summary of the wool contract findings, complete with every ledger entry documented." He paused. "I will want it for a formal presentation." Cecily looked at him. He was still reading, with the particular intentness of a man who has made a decision and is now working out its architecture. She recognized that quality because she had it herself. "To whom will the presentation be made?" she asked. He met her eyes. "To the people who need to understand what you have done here," he said. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. She picked up her list and returned to work. The formal inquiry, for that is what it became, was held on the 4th of March, 1816, at the offices of Langley and Associates in Gray's Inn, which Cecily had not anticipated, but which Langley, when he wrote to her, explained had been requested by the elder Duke of Ashford to formally assess the consulting arrangement and its implications for the Ashford estate. The room was a long paneled chamber that smelled of old wood and professional gravity. When Cecily arrived, there were 9 people already seated. Langley, Harrison, the elder Duke's personal solicitor, 2 members of the Ashford family's investor council, the elder Duke of Ashford himself, a man of 67 with his son's controlled bearing, and the additional weight of a long-held assumption of being right, and to her left and arranged with the careful placement of a woman who knows how a room is composed, Miss Beatrice Graham, attended by her father. The Duke of Ashford arrived 4 minutes after Cecily and took the chair opposite his father without ceremony. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. The elder Duke looked at Cecily across the table with the expression of a man who is about to demonstrate that he has been looking in the right direction all along. "It is my understanding," Cornelius Cavendish said, "that Miss Marsh has been engaged at the Ashford estate for a period exceeding the original agreement, at a fee that Harrison informs me was set well above standard consulting rates, and that my son intends to extend this arrangement indefinitely. I have called this meeting to understand what value has been produced that might justify that expenditure and that departure from expected practice." The departure from expected practice was not about the fee. Cecily set her folder on the table. It was organized with the precision of everything she produced. 7 sections, each ledger entry documented, each calculation verified against 3 independent source entries. She had worked on it for 4 consecutive evenings, and it was the most complete accounting of what she had found that she had ever produced, because she understood that this room needed it to be complete. "I will present what I found," she said. "You may then assess the value." She began with the wool contract. She walked the room through 11 years of overpayment, setting each ledger entry before the relevant party, naming the original miscalculation, identifying the compounding effect. She did not argue, she did not perform. She set documented fact in front of the people who needed to read it and gave them time to read it. She moved to the 3 other supplier contracts she had reviewed, presenting the adjusted terms she had proposed and the projected quarterly saving, £82 per quarter across the 4 corrected arrangements, which over the standard 3-year contract term represented £984 in operational improvement. She moved to the Ashford Estates creditors schedule, where she had identified a renegotiation window that would reduce the annual debt service by £45, available if action was taken before the 1st of April. She set the annotated summary on the table and looked up. The room was quiet. It was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who are reading. Viscount Graham looked at the figures with an expression that could not quite achieve the dismissal it had prepared. One of the investor council members had turned to Harrison with a question about the wool contract source entries, which Harrison answered by pointing to page 3 of Cecily's folder. The elder Duke was reading this summary page with the focused attention of a man who has spent his life evaluating information and has encountered information that requires evaluating. Miss Graham was looking at her hands. "The fee paid to Miss Marsh for 6 weeks' work," said the elder Duke, finally, "is recovered within the first quarter of implemented corrections. Within 8 weeks of the first adjustment," Cecily said, "at which point the ongoing savings represent clear estate improvement." "You found a miscalculation that has existed for 11 years, said the investor council member on the left. He said it as a statement, not an objection. The records room had not been fully reviewed since the previous estate manager's departure, Cecily said. The evidence was present. It required someone to read it. The elder Duke set down the summary page. He looked at his son. Ashford had been sitting very still through the entire presentation, in the way he held himself when he was watching something he has decided about. He held his father's look for a moment, and then he stood. "I called this meeting to make something clear," Ashford said to the room, to his father, to the formal assembly of the social and financial machinery of the life he had been born into. "Not to defend an arrangement, to name what the arrangement has produced and who produced it." He looked at Cecily. "Miss Marsh has recovered a documented £420 in historical overpayment, identified ongoing savings that represent nearly £1,000 over the next contract period, and restructured the estate's creditor schedule at a saving of £45 annually. She has done this in 6 weeks. He paused. "She did comparable work for the Halford household for 3 years without payment or credit." The room absorbed this. The elder Duke did not look away from his son. "I intend to ask Miss Marsh to marry me," Ashford said. It was not the speech of a man requesting permission. It was the speech of a man making a record. "I am informing this room because this room is owed the information, not because it requires its approval." He looked at Miss Graham once, briefly, not with cruelty. "I am sorry, Miss Graham. You are deserving of better than a man who has already made a different decision." Miss Graham looked up. Her expression had the particular composure of a woman who is going to be entirely fine and knows it, even if the present moment costs something. She inclined her head. It was, Cecily thought, a dignified thing. The system had told her she was the right answer, and the system had been wrong, and she was absorbing that with more grace than the system deserved. Langley, who had not spoken during the presentation, looked at Cecily across the table with an expression she now recognized completely. The expression of a man who always believed what he was looking at, and has been waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. The elder Duke looked at the summary page. He looked at his son. He looked, for the first time and with the slow attention of a man adjusting a lens he has held at the wrong angle for a long time, at Cecily Marsh. "You would have found this in 11 months, he said to her. It was not an apology. It was the specific acknowledgement of a man who assesses precisely and has just completed an assessment that found him wrong. "I would have found it in 6 weeks, she said gently. I simply needed someone to give me the room." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes, I see that. It was not warmth, it was not conversion. It was the partial, imperfect recalibration of a man who takes longer than he should, but eventually reads what is in front of him." It was enough. Ashford crossed to where she was standing. He was aware of the 9 people in the room. He appeared, from his expression, to consider this appropriate rather than inconvenient. He took her hand, her bare right hand, which she had removed from its glove to turn the ledger pages, and held it for a moment, and then he bent and kissed it, in the old formal way that meant something specific in 1816 to every person in that room. It meant that he was naming before witnesses what he knew. The room did not erupt. There was a long suspended moment in which the investor council member on the left put down his pen, and Langley made a small sound that might have been satisfaction. And Viscount Graham looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man recalibrating the arrangement of his afternoon. She looked at Ashford, her hand still in his, in the middle of the Gray's Inn chamber, with 9 witnesses and a folder of documented evidence on the table. She thought about it. She thought about it completely, in the way she thought about every important thing. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the full weight of her attention. She thought about the West Records room and the library at midnight, and the music room at morning. She thought about the boy breathing on her shoulder. She thought about the particular quality of a room that has 2 people in it who are content to be there together, she said. Yes, simple and direct and complete. They were married in the spring at the Ashford, Berkshire estate, in a ceremony that was small by ducal standards and included Mr. Langley and Helena Price and Mrs. Finn and James, who was 5 years old by then, and wore a very serious expression throughout, and held Cecily's hand during the breakfast afterward with the concentrated affection of a small person who has decided where his allegiances lie. The private declaration had come 2 evenings before the ceremony. In the library, which had become by habit and mutual agreement the room where things that were true got said, Ashford had sat across from her with the contained stillness that she now knew was not coldness, but the architecture of a man who measures before he speaks. "Not because it is convenient," he said, "or because it is the resolution the social arrangement requires, or because you have demonstrated a quality of mind I have not encountered before, though you have." He stopped. He looked at her with the directness of someone who has given up an intermediary layer. "But because this house has felt like a different building since you came into it, and because my son holds your hand, and because I went into the music room for the first time in 4 years because I wanted to hear what you found there, you are the most necessary person I have encountered, and I have been trying for 2 months to find a less direct way of saying it." She looked at him for a moment. He waited, which was something she had come to understand was, for him, its own form of declaration. "You will have to stop leaving the cravat," she said. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that was not amusement exactly, but was adjacent to it. "The cravat," he said. "It has been a problem on 4 separate occasions. I believe it is a habit." "I will endeavor," he said. with the gravity of a man accepting terms to address it. She picked up his hand from the arm of the chair where it rested. She held it for a moment, his bare hand large and warm against her fingers. "I accept," she said. "The terms are agreeable." The domestic alliance she had made with Mrs. Finn deepened over the years into something that looked from the outside like a professional arrangement, and was from the inside a genuine mutual regard between two women who knew how to keep things standing. Helena Price visited twice a year and was always, upon arrival, immediately right about something Cecily had not wanted to admit aloud, and they had reached the comfortable understanding of friends who are honest with each other, even when it costs something. Langley retired in 1818 and sent Cecily a letter that she placed in the box beneath the desk, which was larger now and contained more things that were true and worth remembering. James grew. He grew with the serious thoughtfulness of his father, and something else, something more open and ready to be delighted, which Cecily had not taken credit for, but which Helena had pointed out with considerable directness, was the result of being raised in proximity to a woman who paid full attention to whatever was in front of her. He was 6 when his sister was born. They named her Eleanor, for Ashford's mother, and he carried the weight of being an older sibling with a gravity that made Cecily love him completely. Eleanor, at 2 years old, had a habit of escaping the nursery and making her way to the library, which had been identified as the room of greatest interest. She could not yet reach the shelf where the ledgers were kept, but she made clear through her investigative method that this was a temporary situation. On a November morning in 1820, Cecily was reviewing the estate accounts, the comprehensive annual account that had been adopted, through Langley's recommendation in the last year of his practice, by 4 neighboring estates as a model for their own management, when she heard the sound of small, determined feet in the corridor. She did not look up immediately. She heard Ashford's voice somewhere in the distance, the quiet word that meant Eleanor had been intercepted, and then footsteps, and then he appeared in the doorway, with a 2-year-old duchess in training on his shoulder, who was expressing her views on the subject of interception with philosophical vigor. He stood there for a moment, his daughter making her argument against his ear, and looked at Cecily at the desk with the annotated accounts in front of her. He looked at her the way he looked at things he had decided about, fully, without requiring anything from the looking. She looked up. She met his eyes. The candle on the desk threw its light across the annual accounts that 4 estates had used to make their management better, and across the woman who had produced them, and across the man who had found the door in the wall and opened it. She had been always this person. The world had simply taken an unconscionable amount of time to look. "Your cravat," she said. He reached up with the hand that was not managing Eleanor, found the loose edge, straightened it. He was watching her face while he did it. She let him watch. Eleanor declared a temporary ceasefire and leaned her small head against her father's shoulder, and the library was warm, and the accounts were finished, and the life they had built together held its own weight completely without anyone having to hold it up.